Good afternoon. Thank you for joining today's webinar, How to Turn Recall Crisis into a Normal Business Process. I'm Jim Dudlasek, NGA's Director of Communications and External Affairs. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items. This webinar is being recorded, so to ensure clean recording, we do mute all participants. We welcome your questions, which will be addressed during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. You can submit your questions using the question feature located on the right side of your GoToWebinar screen. Please refer to the antitrust statement on the screen. We do take antitrust laws seriously at NGA, so during this presentation, please refrain from any conversations about price fixing. The inconvenience of recalls flows down the supply chain, landing squarely in retailers' laps. But what if it didn't have to be that way? How can the interruption be simplified, damage minimized, and cost recovered? Today, our speakers will discuss how to change the narrative around a recall crisis with simple process improvements, technology implementation, and global connectivity, so you can better understand what a modernized and standardized recall process looks like. Our speakers today are David Acheson, Roger Hancock, Jim Flannery, and Bill Pohl. Dr. David Acheson is the founder, president, and CEO of the Acheson Group with more than 30 years of medical and food safety experience. He has served various roles at the USDA and FDA, including Chief Medical Officer and Director of Food Defense Communication and Emergency Response, and FDA Associate Commissioner for Foods, during which time he developed the 2007 Food Protection Plan. Roger Hancock is President and CEO of Recall InfoLink, which he founded in 2007 after spending more than 16 years at Albertsons as its Director of Food Safety and QA, as which he directed 250 recalls a year and played a critical role in the company's adoption of new technologies to improve the recall process. Jim Flannery is CEO of Summit Ventures, a consumer products consultancy focused on helping brands grow their businesses by building consumer and trading partner trust. Prior to starting Summit Ventures in 2019, he was Senior Executive Vice President at the Grocery Manufacturers Association, now the Consumer Brands Association. He joined GMA in 2013 after spending 36 years at Procter & Gamble. And Bill Pohl is Director of Regulatory Compliance for Roche Brothers Supermarkets in Boston, where he started as a bagger 36 years ago at age 15 and moved his way up through various positions for the retailer. Bill is building a food safety culture at Roche Brothers and is involved in other areas of compliance such as recalls, OSHA, and price scanning. So with that, I'll hand the discussion off to Dr. Acheson, who will get us started with our first question.
Thanks, Jim. Sorry, there was a lot of background noise there for just a sec. So I'm going to begin the conversation around focusing on some of the pain points of recalls. Clearly, recalls are just nothing but pain, and we always want to try to avoid them, but it's an inherent part of life. Recognizing that the bulk of our audience here is kind of at one end of the supply chain. And as Jim pointed out, often are the recipients of recalls as it lands squarely in your lap to try to solve a problem. But increasingly, everybody in the supply chain is in a position where they may find themselves the center of attention and actually needing to initiate a recall, even a retail operation. Particularly if you are making things yourself in a deli area or sandwiches or juice bar or such things. So the key pain points as we think about this is, from my perspective, are kind of you can land them into almost two buckets, of which they get expansive. One is just the economics, is simply the cost of a recall. Any recall has economic consequences, whether that's lost sales, whether that's time and resources you have to spend on identifying products that need to be dealt with, removing them, empty shelf space. So there's unquestionably an economic consequence, and depending where you are in the supply chain, that economic consequence can be absolutely massive. Certainly, if you're a little further up and you're a manufacturer, there are plenty of instances where recalls are in the multi-million-dollar range, potentially going as high as 100 million or above. Now, clearly, those are P&L threatening kinds of numbers. They are very serious economic consequences, and they can create a crisis for a company that is independent of the recall itself. The second, I think, huge bucket of pain for a recall is your reputation. And there are many, many angles to that. As we think about reputation for somebody who's involved in a recall or is executing a recall, it's like, well, who are the stakeholders to whom our reputation matters? And again, that depends on where you are in the supply chain. But certainly if we're talking about the front end, the consumer-facing side of the supply chain, some of your biggest threat, your biggest reputational component is your customers, consumers, the public. Now that applies obviously to anybody in the supply chain, whether you're a grower right through to manufacturer or processor, if your brand ultimately winds up facing consumers. So it's a consumer recognized brand. The second big part of reputation, if your entire business is not to consumers, to customers, is obviously your other business customers, is your reputation there, which is huge if you're a manufacturer or a processor, because they will think, well, am I still trustworthy? If I've had a recall, is that indicative of an underlying problem? Another huge point where reputation really matters is with regulators. The importance of that is, depending on the situation, you may find that the regulators are paying a lot of attention to you. If they believe that you are the cause of a recall or the cause of a public health issue or the cause of a problem, then they're going to be all over you. And whether that's local or state or federal, then your reputation with the regulators is really important. So, as we think about that, we have to think about how we may hear about a recall in the context of your reputation. And it may come in because you've had a message or a communication from a supplier saying, hey, we got a problem with a product, you need to clear it off the shelf. From a retail perspective, while not necessarily operationally simple, it's operationally straightforward. You kind of know what you got to do. Where it gets more complex is if there is a belief that you perhaps had something to do with creating the problem in the first place. And then you get into some very complex issues about, well, is it really me? The epidemiology points to being, perhaps I'm implicated, but do I need to take an action? If I need to take an action, how broad is that action? Which then gets you back to understanding what the root cause is. When did the problem occur? Is it 1 week's worth of production? Is it 1 day's worth of production? Is it shelf life? And it can be anything in between. And part of the strategy there is, when it comes to your reputation, obviously it is in relation to media, whether it's social media or mainstream media, as well as the regulators and your customers and consumers. So as part of that, the strategy is, if you're going to do a recall, do it once. Don't come back for a second bite. Several years ago, well, 10 years ago maybe, I'd say regulators were more lenient in allowing companies to give us time, we'll figure it out. We'll figure out the root cause and we'll figure out the bookends. Where did it begin? Where did it end? So we're good. In today's environment, I have been on many calls with companies who have had a call from either typically FDA with a request, hey, we need to get you on the phone with something we want to talk to you about. That is never a good day. But when you get on the phone, it kind of begins with, we've got some evidence that would suggest your product may be implicated. And you listen to the story and you follow through. And literally during the course of the phone conversation, the regulators may say, well, we think your product is implicated. What are you going to do about it? And you've got like no time to think about it. You've got no time to question it. And if they believe that they are in a strong position, and I've seen this happen several times in the last 12 months, the FDA will say, well, we've got a press release that we're going to put out in the next 2 hours warning the public not to eat your product. What are you going to do? That is about the worst place to be, because typically you're sideswiped, you're not expecting it, and you are total deer in the headlights. And you know you don't want to do 2 recalls, so you sort of find yourself in a position of, man, do I need to recall everything? Well, going back to my first pain point, the economics of that are huge. So I want to limit this, but I don't want to do 2. And clearly that gives you a very sleepless night, and creates a lot of anguish and a lot of anxiety. I think my final point, before I sort of love to get input from my colleagues here, is I think often retailers and operators at that end of the spectrum feel like, you know, we're just a pass through. We sell the product. If there's a problem, we'll move it off the shelves and we'll have a bill and we'll just simply send it to our supplier. The supplier will pay it. I wish life was so simple. It isn't. It's not that simple for 2 reasons. First of all, your supplier, if they're getting inundated because they've really caused a problem, may not have the wherewithal to pay you. So they may have gone belly up very quickly, especially if they're a small supplier. The second part, which I've personally seen happen, and it's happening more frequently, especially if you're a big brand, is it works through the recall, people have got sick, and then the plaintiff attorneys move in and they see that you're a big brand and you've got deep pockets, and the lawsuits begin to fly. And you will get sued, even though all you did was to take a product out of a case and put it on a shelf and sell it. You did nothing more to it. Why do you get sued? Because you didn't do due diligence on your supply chain. You actually put product into commerce that made somebody sick. You didn't cause it, but you were part of it. You've got deep pockets. Everybody further up the supply chain has folded. They've gone under. You're the only one left standing, potentially with a very large bill. So all this pertains to understanding the consequences. And I think my final point here, the best way you can manage all of these things, because it will happen, and it does happen, is to be prepared. Have good systems, have good data analytics, be able to follow up really quickly, build a program and practice it. Clearly there's a lot more pain we could talk about, but I think those are some of the key points, and love to get input from my colleagues.
David, maybe I can jump in here, because my pain point kind of builds on yours. So my whole background has been on the commercial side of the business and sales and marketing. There's a ton of work that goes on in companies, suppliers, manufacturers, to make sure a product is safe. And every once in a while, those things go wrong, right? So it's the work that you were talking about, to understanding, do I need to have a product recall? If so, I only want to do this once, and all the decisions about that. My pain is the next step, right? Oh my God, we need a recall now. What do I do? So it's actually how we need to communicate that recall out through the supply chain and get the product back to protect the brands and protect the consumers. And the biggest problems that I faced in my career with P&G, and I carried it over to some of the work I tried to do in GMA, average. A typical supplier probably has to do a product recall once every 3 years. Right, so it's not something that people do regularly. I was running the P&G business in Australia, New Zealand, and I remember early on in my tenure there, we had some contaminant that got into shampoo, and the aroma was off, right? So it was a voluntary withdrawal, but everybody was like, okay, now what do we do? How do we communicate it? And it's not something that typical manufacturers practice. In the work that I've done with Roger and team, we talked about it. You don't wait till the building's on fire to practice your first fire drill. So for companies that are producers, we need to find a way to practice the physical withdrawal, the communication of the recall, and getting it off the shelf, so that when you have to happen, it's not created from the ground up. In fact, in my experience, I was in Australia for 5 years. We had a recall, one of the first weeks I was there. We had a recall one of the last weeks that I was there, and it was reinventing it all over again. So that need to practice the recall is really important. And then, frankly, for guys like Bill and the other, the other retailers on the phone, you guys deal with recalls weekly. And so that was the other pain point, is how do manufacturers communicate that recall in a way that the retailers can actually ingest it and absorb it and do something. And if you don't know how to do a recall because you've done it frequently, it creates quite a degree of chaos. When I went to the GMA, and this is kind of how I got involved in this space, I heard loud and clear it wasn't just my pain point, but the manufacturer community had that pain point, and then the retailer community said, guys, if you think it's a pain for you, you should sit on our end of the desk. So we tried to create communication standards that would allow a supplier to get all the information they need. So David talked about, do I need a recall? What's impacted? Once that gets handed off, how do I get all the information I need so that I can get it into every retailer who needs to take action on it in a way that the retailer can absorb it. And then, frankly, on that project team, the retailers actually set an objective, and we got to do it complete and timely. So if there's a product recall, we set an objective that information has to get to the retailers simultaneous or within 30 minutes of any kind of public release, because there's nothing worse than a consumer hearing about a recall, going to the shelf and seeing the product and say, well, wait a minute, you're not protecting me. So those are my pain points. It's really taking that recall communication. How do I get it out there? Simple, fast, accurate, and in a way that the retailers can take action on.
Jim, following up to what you just mentioned on your particular area of recalls, being in retail for as many years as I have, I've seen many recalls, and over the past few years, I've started to get involved in it under my position that I'm in. But the pains that everybody has at specific levels, but even at retail level, you can be sitting at home on a weekend watching TV, and you see on the news this recall comes up. I'm like, I haven't heard anything from my distributor, my vendors, or anything. And I'm like, do they know? And is it just a manufacturer that knows currently? And why hasn't this been passed on to everyone who should be reporting it to me? And then you have like 21 different stores reaching out to you saying, hey, what about this item? Are we pulling it? And you're like, I have to wait. You're kind of waiting. And that's the pain that you have. You're kind of waiting to find out, one, do we carry the item? Was it at our particular warehouse that we got product from? So it can become stressful at times on that particular end, because you have to get back not only to the people at store level, but you also have to be ready to answer the questions from customers as they come in as a phone call or the returning product at the front service desk of your stores. So I think the pain level goes from top to bottom, bottom to top.
Bill, to build up. Sorry, Jim, go ahead.
Go ahead, David. I was going to say, so this is our industry is a relationship industry, right? I mean, you build the relationships between people, and I think that gets in the way, right? So one of the most common practices, and I think one of the reasons information comes out incomplete is, when I was, running a country, if I had a recall, my sales organization wanted to be the ones to communicate it to the retailer. So there's a handoff from my central information to the sales folks. Frankly, they interpret it or they take it to the buyer in the way that they want to build a relationship. And honestly, that's no way to protect consumer and brand integrity. All right. This isn't a relationship issue. This is getting the information out there quick, fast, accurate, without room for error. I'm sorry, David, go ahead.
No, what I was, that's a very good point, Jim. And I was going to build off Bill's point is, I think there's innumerable times, and those of you in the retail space, I'm sure have felt it. Bill, obviously, clearly you have, is you hear about something through mainstream media and your question is, does that implicate product I've got in my store or under my control? And I think the poster child for that was the fallout from the Peanut Corporation of America. When back in 2008, 2009, we clearly got a salmonella outbreak. In January, the first recall was triggered And the questions were coming in thick and fast. Is like, do I have any of that product in the things I'm selling? You know, the cookies, the crackers, the this, the that, the other. And I heard many times there that retailers were calling their suppliers and saying, are we using this stuff? And no, we're not. No, you're fine. And you know the rest of the story, because the recalls began in January and they rolled through February and March and April and into May as individuals realized, it's like, whoa, I thought I was clear, but I'm not. And that was over 3,000 recalls at the end of the day from that one set of problems. I think that then triggered things in the Food Safety Modernization Act around supply chain and knowing who's in your supply chain. And one of the best safeguards, not easy, is for retailers to know who's in their upstream supply chain. It's easier said than done, I realize that. But the more you know about that, the more you're going to be prepared so that you're not blindsided, or you know more quickly whether a given product is something that you receive. It still doesn't, it's not 100%, but understanding your upstream supply chain is a great way to be able to manage that risk.
Yeah, if I could jump in here, this has been really fascinating. Right at the outset, David mentioned the word perspective. And as I've listened to the comments, the pain that people experience with a recall is totally driven by what their perspective is. Are they a manufacturer? Are they in the boardroom? If they're in the boardroom, yeah, cost and brand reputation are going to be huge pain points. If they're a retailer on the front line, getting the right information quickly before your customers get it is going to be the pain point. If you're in the middle, it's knowing who's supplying you and knowing who your customers are. And so this speed and accuracy thing plays out a little bit differently as you flow down the supply chain. But operationally, that seems to be pain that starts at the top and kind of cascades down, and then cascading back up more and more today, as you kind of alluded to, David, is the need for documentation. When the regulators come in, they want to see what you did. They don't want to hear what you did only. They want to hear what you did and then see proof of what you did as illustrated in documentation. And so, yeah, cost is a huge pain. Brand reputation is a huge pain. Speed of information flow, accuracy of information flow, and then to tie all those kind of together, documentation, so that you can protect your brand, so that you can minimize costs, so that you can simplify your regulatory process. Seems like all of these things, depending on your perspective, are going to be a little bit higher in the pain category or a little bit lower in the pain category. But it seems like those four buckets, cost, brand reputation, speed, and accuracy, are the big ones. And then documentation kind of is the umbrella over all of it. Yeah, so this has been really good discussion.
You know, I think, Roger, where that all sits, the more prepared you are, the less pain there'll be. And I think that's a critical message. And well, how prepared do I need to be? And the answer is pretty prepared.
Yeah.
And have all of those systems in place.
Well, and to link that to what Jim said, it isn't only you. Part of your preparation is that your supply chain or your trading partners have similar preparation. Because if you're all prepared, but you have to wait 3 days to get the message from Peanut Corporation of America, or 3 months to get the message from Peanut Corporation of America, how prepared were you really? Well, you were internally prepared to process the recall, but since your trading partner wasn't prepared, it left you in the lurch, which leaves your customers in the lurch. So being prepared, I think from what I'm hearing, actually extends a little bit beyond your own domain to connect with your trading partners, kind of in a community perspective.
That's
and
why
I don't want to put word in Bill's mouth, but the frequency that a retailer has to deal with the product recall. Guys, you're prepared. Like it or not, you're doing this on a repetitive basis. The preparation, frankly, the practice that, if I were a retailer, the demand would be that the supplier community get recall ready, right? And not wait to that once every 3-year crisis to figure out how to do it. And again, I think that, the reason for that we're all here is because there's a way to get prepared. There's a way to use GS1 standards to communicate to trading partners that action must be taken.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely. And one could argue, Bill, push back on me, but if if resources were unlimited, which they are not, and I realize that, but in the ideal world, you would have perfect upstream insight. And so, and as part of that, you would have ensured, to Jim's point, that your supplier and your supplier's supplier have got robust recall programs and traceback programs, and if they have a problem, you're going to know it quick.
Right.
That's part of. Yeah.
You're absolutely right, David. Because on a retailer end of it, my recall is only as successful as the amount of information that I'm able to get quickly, whether it be noticed on a FMI, FDA, USDA information from my warehouse supplier, or even just a particular vendor that calls on a category manager. So, I need to, on my end of it, get it as fast as I can and then take care of it from there to get it to the store level.
That's exactly right, Bill. And I can't tell you how many manufacturers who sell to 30 distributors think they've protected their brand as soon as they process the recall. And I'm telling you, brand isn't protected at any distribution center or warehouse across the country. Brand is protected in your stores. Brand is protected when that product that's been recalled isn't available for sale anymore. And so the ability to get the recall across the supply chain to where the rubber meets the road, where the consumer is buying it, that's where the brand gets protected. So you're right, getting the right information when you need it so that you know what to do is critical.
Maybe I can move ahead to a little bit of the solution to this thing, and I'm going to go back to my analogy of you don't wait until the building's on fire to run a fire drill. If you think of that fire drill example, every building owner, right, has a plan. They know where people to go. They know how to do the head counts of the people that are around, and then they practice it. Now, that practice of it is really not that great a value. The value comes in that you had a plan. The practice really is that insurance policy, so that when something goes wrong, people can get it out. And I think that's the same kind of discipline that needs to be taken into this recall process, right? We talk about creating this recall-ready community. We've talked to a lot of different companies about the need to practice the process, and people say, well, why do I need to practice it? Well, because if you don't, when you really need it, you wish you would have had to practice it, right? So this making sure there's a plan, making sure there's a technical capability to do this. It's like that insurance policy you have. You don't need it until you need it, but when you need it, you really need it now. And I think that's the discipline we need to build in here, right? So if manufacturers regularly practice the physical product recall portion of it, just like they do, like in GFSI, they do practice the identification of the supply chain stuff, but they don't practice how do I get it out of the supply chain. If that plan is there, if they practice that plan, and I'm going to go back to it can't be one plan that then gets divided into 30 different plans. It's got to be one plan that's able to translate into the way their retailers receive it. That's how the product's going to get off the shelves.
Yeah, I like that, Jim. The FDA, they released their blueprint for the new era of food safety. And I believe it's section 6. I don't have the number right off the top of my head, but they talk about recalls, and they talk about a modernized recall plan. And what we've seen for years is this mock recall process that you talk about, where the practice is what went wrong, what products were produced, and where are those products. And once those 3 questions are answered kind of globally, what went wrong, what products were impacted, where are those products, then they stop and they say, we've done our mock recall. But that doesn't really prepare them, as you're pointing out, to remove product from the supply chain. It gets them ready for sure, but they're not recall ready. They're just knowledgeably ready. To take the next step to get recall ready, they need to practice. Okay, so what do I need to tell Bill? What do I need to tell Bill about the items that are affected? What does he need to do about it? And if Bill gets asked questions, what kind of answers do I want Bill to give his customers so that he's giving them the information that they need while also protecting brand? So there's a whole recall component that's, I think, ready to be added to the standard mock recall to kind of modernize it in the way that the FDA is saying they want their.
Yeah, and I think it's a full circle approach, right? So it's not just communicating the recall out, but this practice process makes sure that you've got the systems in place to understand. Did they hear my recall notification? Did they take the action that I asked them to take, and where in the supply chain is this product now? So it's that practice of the communication out, and then ensuring that the systems are in place where you get the feedback loop, so that first of all you've got assurances that your consumers are protected, but then as regulators are asking, prove to me this stuff came off the shelf, you have to have the ability to do that.
I think another point here too is we talk about recalls as if one size fits all, and we all know they don't. And when a problem is identified, if you think about it, there are a variety of ways in which it pops up. There may be a call from a supplier saying we've had a problem and you need to hold your ingredient, don't use it. And of course, that puts everybody in a tailspin. Well, like, what's up with it? Is this going to be a recall? What do I do? You may get a call from a regulatory agency saying, we've got some epidemiological evidence linking your product with some illnesses. We want to talk to you. You may have found the problem. You may have got some product on QC hold that got out of the warehouse. Like that never happens. And you think you got your arms around it and you haven't. So, and if some of those are obvious, other times you discover something like maybe a low level of a pesticide in an ingredient that you've used in that product's in commerce. So a big part of practicing it is aside from just knowing where you've used that ingredient, where is it, when did we use it, and where is it now, is like, does this even trigger a recall? Does this represent a health hazard? And if it does, is it a reasonable probability of a serious adverse health consequence or death, i.e. a class 1 that's going to trigger a press release? Is it a remote possibility of serious but reversible medical condition, class 2, or is it unlikely to cause any medical problems, class 3? Those drive speed, need to engage with the reportable food registry if you're FDA, depending on whether it's a 1 or not. And it certainly drives the degree of urgency, and it drives the threat, and it drives the depth, because you may not even be calling Bill because, hey, this is a pretty trivial thing. Yes, it's a violation, but we're just going to pull it back from the DC and that's enough. So there's so much more to this of being ready and thinking about it. And when these things happen, they happen so fast, and there is a need to be super responsive. And you can only do that if you know what the heck you're doing. If you're trying to figure it out on the fly, you'll come unglued, guaranteed.
Great points.
We're moving to the next slide. You know, we talk about, you know, the pains that we've had, and from a retailer's perspective, even my years as a category manager, and even being a grocery manager out in the stores, you're like, what are we doing with the product, and how can we speed this up? And as a category manager years ago, you know, you get a recall thrown across your desk, whether it's from the warehouse wholesaler or vendor, and you're like, okay, how am I going to get it out there? And then you're like emailing 21 stores, which you're including 3 people, 4 people per store, and then you're hoping you get the information back in a timely fashion to feel confident that the product is removed from your shelf, not only protect the customer, but also to protect yourself in case you have regulators come in. What are you doing, or what have you done? And show me what you've done. And almost 5+ years ago, Roach Brothers, with me coming on board as you know, food safety and regulatory compliance company, Recall InfoLink fell into my lap, and it was like, for recalls, it was like hitting a home run, because it streamlined it. It made it simple. You know, the process of being able to have a solution or have a program that 1 or 2 people or 3 people, how many resources you have involved in the recall process, can gather that information. You have a process in place, you know the person that's handled it, you plug it into this system, everything is in there. You know, why is it being recalled? Is it a class 1, 2, or 3? What items does it affect, based off of not just the description, could be a UPC code, or it may not be a product you have in your building. It may be a specific lot number that never came across your particular warehouse, or that is in your location. And so then you know whether you have to send the recall out, but it's a sense of comfort knowing that you have a process in place. Again, years ago, it used to take beyond hours or sometimes days to get that correct information back, whether the product's been removed from the shelf. And the worst thing is to have to get up in your car and drive down and find out if it's been removed from a particular location because you have no response. But with Recall InfoLink, you put the solution together, you put all the information, what they need, what the item they need to pull, what the expectation is to do with the product, you know, sending it back to your supplier or disposing of it. And you have multiple options of placing a timeline of what you want for a response. And, you know, currently for Roach Brothers, we have a 2-hour window response because some people don't get their emails right away because they're on the floor. But I have 4 people in each location of my store, of all 21 stores, that will get a email. And then also operations receives an email as well. So if they're out in the stores, they're able to say, hey, I just got an email on a recall. Do you have the product? Let's go pull it. So I have a 2-hour window. If I don't hear from them, the store does receive a phone call. The store will also receive a fax that there's a particular recall. And for Roach Brothers, it's been very successful. I'd say maybe less than a handful of times I've been asked by a regulator in a town to prove that we pulled the product from the shelf. Unfortunately, that was based off of a customer reaching out to the health department to see if we did do our due diligence, and we did. And that information can be pulled up right away. Here it is. This is what we have. This is what we pulled. And it's very comforting to know that we're going to be able to take care of it in a fast manner for stores.
You know, I think,
Thanks,
I think a comment on that, in which Recall InfoLink fits right in there, is we're in an era where data is king. Mm-hmm. And you know, somebody mentioned earlier the new era of food safety, smarter food safety, FDA strategy. Tech-enabled food safety solutions are critical. We're frankly, I think everybody in the industry is drowning in information. They're drowning in data. Let me be specific, because they are data rich and often information poor. And Recall InfoLink is just a great example where all that stuff is sitting there. And it's not like you can't discover it with enough time and enough pads of paper and a pencil. But you know, the essence is speed and accuracy, and turning all of that information into actionable data is actionable items, actionable information is key. And that's, to me, that's exactly what the Recall InfoLink solution is doing. It's getting that information, just like you said, Bill. You know, it's getting it out fast, efficiently, completely, with that inevitable, well, did you do it? Well, yeah, sure I did, Inspector. Well, show me. Well, I didn't write it down, then you didn't do it.
Right.
And then you're scrambling. So it just plays right into where the whole industry is moving and needs to continue to move into sort of tech-enabled solutions.
Yeah, and that solution's available not only up at corporate level, which I'm responsible for the recalls, but it's also, you know, at store level. They can get it through their cell phone by clicking on the link. They can get it through their email, print off what was taken from the shelf. And like you said, David, years ago, you'd write it down on a piece of paper, throw it away after a day. Yeah, corporate has it, and then they come in and you're like, oh, I don't have that information, you know. And you know, it's kind of embarrassing, you know, and then you don't want to deal with any particular specific consequences or have your name tarnished saying, well, you know, they did remove it, but they don't keep information or good records and stuff like that. But like I said, Recall InfoLink, I mean, it can any the service level of questions right on the spot. I mean, they're there to answer it right away. But their solution itself, it really just tells you how to fill out that recall and what information you need to provide for your stores. It's a great solution to have.
And, you know, and it is also checking one of the boxes on my pain points, which is maintaining your reputation with the regulators.
Yes.
If when they come in and ask you, well, did you do it? And can you show me? It's like, yep, here it is, boom, 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 boom. You know, particularly on the retail side, if it has not been you that caused it, then, you know, you're home free because you've checked all those boxes and they think, oh, this is a buttoned up organization. And, you know, there's nothing like, and I speak in here as an ex-regulator, there's nothing like pulling on loose threads. You know, you go in and you just check that somebody's done it right and you find they haven't. And it's like, well, I wonder what else in this organization isn't working for you. And regulatory agencies just love loose threads to pull on because they find stuff. And anyway, it's sort of, it checks that box as well.
Let me just tell a real.
Yeah, let me, if I can, let me just jump.
Go ahead, Jim.
I was going to say, let me jump here. So it ticks a box for me too. You know, as a supplier, anytime there's a recall, that tends to be a subject matter expert that manages the recall, and the old way that information would then be given to all the salespeople, so each of them could do the translation into the retailer's language. You know, what Recall InfoLink does is it becomes that universal adapter, right? So the subject matter expert can enter that data in one location, and then the system takes over from there and communicates to the retailers the way they need to see it. And you know, we talk about speed, but it's the accuracy of the data is almost more important than speed, right? So if you get it out there really fast, but the wrong information, that's not helpful. And I think Recall InfoLink's ability to enter the data once and it be the universal adapter that gets it out to the retailers is where the magic is for me.
Well, and you helped create some of that magic, Jim, by leading the committee that created the standard for the package that Recall InfoLink is built on. I was just going to tell a real quick story to kind of illustrate your point, David. One of our clients said the regulatory visit used to be the worst part of the recall. We would pull tons of files out of our file cabinet. We would go into the conference room. The regulator was uncomfortable. We were uncomfortable. We didn't have good answers to all his questions. And 2 or 3 hours later, he would leave. Now, the regulator comes in, we get him a cup of coffee. We sit down in the office. I open up my Recall InfoLink account. I show him the screens that answer his questions, and he leaves 30 minutes later, and we're both happy. So to your point, it really does eliminate the loose threads that get pulled on. because the answers are packaged up and it makes the whole experience. And Bill, the same is true that you pointed out at the store. If you're at a store, if you're at an office, the availability of the data solves at least that part of the pain of the recall. So yeah, I just thought I'd share that one little anecdotal story. And thanks to you, Jim, for your leadership on that data standardization side. Have we had any questions from the audience, Jim?
Well, I was just going to ask if you're all ready for questions, and since we're approaching sort of the home stretch of our presentation, I'll throw a few out there. Do you have any recommendations for the best way of getting product affected by a recall out of the supply chain in a timely fashion?
Well,
I'll jump in there from my experience. I think the answer to that question is going to frankly be retailer system specific, right? So I don't think that there's a generic answer. You know, so some of the best practices that I've seen, actually I've seen a couple of examples where the recall notification gets out, the product is pulled off the shelf and pulled into the back room, and then somebody comes in later in that day and hadn't seen the notification and pulls it off the back room and puts it back on the shelf. So clearly a best practice that when the product is removed from the shelf, it's marked and identified as handling a recall. And then I think there are a bunch of all kind of reverse logistics provider that can handle the physical flow of that.
so actually,
I think that's.
And Bill, how do you get the stuff back from your stores?
I didn't hear that.
How do you get products back from your stores when there's a recall?
When there's a recall from, well, I mean, Roach Brothers, we don't have our own warehouse, right? So what happens is whatever is given to us from Bazzuto's is our main warehouse supplier, or other vendors we have, and they have a specific guideline of what to do, whether you dispose of it, if it's a perishable item, empty the product out and just send us the container, put it in a particular, a lot of cases, a banana box or a tote, put for reclamation, mark recall, and then it goes back for credit. And then we get the credit based off of the results of what the stores give me for numbers, and we get that back to the specific vendor or supplier with that information.
Yeah. Hey, Roger, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the recall infolink system, there are actually physical flow directions that the supplier can send out with the recall. So the supplier can send it out and say, take this from your shelf and destroy it, or take this from your shelf and set it aside and we'll come pick it up, or take this from your shelf and send it back to your distributor and we'll pick up there. So those physical recall instructions are included in the messaging, right?
so that's where I was going to begin my answer. Really, the best way to get it out of the supply chain is to follow the directions that are given by the supplier. And the best practice for the supplier is to include very clear, specific directions about how to handle their product, including, as you alluded to, Jim, maybe even signage, so that when the day crew pulls the product off sale and puts it in the back in banana boxes, Bill, to go to reclamation, the night crew doesn't come in and fill an open hole on the shelf, because that's how they're measured when they leave, how many holes are still on the shelf, put the recall product back on. So maybe it's including signage, but it starts with clear directions that are delivered in a timely way, following those directions. And then I guess the follow-up when those things don't happen is a good point of contact to get a hold of. To David's point, do you know who's supplying you, who your suppliers are? A good point of contact to get a hold of, to say, hey, I got your recall notice. I've got a box of stuff that I pulled off the shelf. What do you want me to do? Because you're only as good as the instructions you get for what to do with the product when it comes to getting it off sale.
You're correct about that, Roger. I mean, but like I say, with Recall InfoLink, as a person who fills it out all the time for the stores and on what to do, I mean, every section is there. What do you need to do with it? Does it go back to reclaim, dispose of, back to manufacturer, back to distributor? I mean, it's pretty simple. Straightforward, and it gives every possible scenario for the stores for not to ask you a question back once you send it.
No, and it's very important to get that right for economic purposes, and there are situations where the regulators want to witness destruction. So if you just sort of follow your own whim and you sling it in the dumpster out back, that could get you in all sorts of bother. Especially, we've seen many instances of dumpster diving and things that have been rescued and gone on the gray market and all sorts of horrible things. Mm-hmm. So you do have to do it right.
Very good.
I heard Jim mention the idea that accuracy is more important than speed in this process. Leading to this question, what actually is the biggest information gap during a recall?
Well, I guess my first answer to that question is I had a retailer with hundreds of stores say to me, actually 80% of the work that I do for recalls, and I'm thinking hundreds of stores, it's got to be store related. He said 80% of the work that I do for recalls is contacting my manufacturer to make sure that I have all the information before I take action. And the principal data point that he was referring to with all the information was supply, where product had been supplied. It wasn't the item description, it wasn't the item UPC, it was which warehouses were sent to the recalled product. And part of the reason that's important is because warehouses don't do a great job of tracking lot codes or date codes or sell-by information. And so knowing which warehouses were shipped recalled product can prevent over recalling product, removing stuff because it has the same UPC, but it's not the specific lot code. And so one of the big gaps, I think, is distribution of product in distribution of recalled product. Where did it go? Other thoughts?
Roger, that's one of the looking at it from a manufacturer or processor lens. That is one of you lose visibility of the product, and you don't, know who you've shipped it to, and you may be able to call the DC and say, how many cases or pallets of this do you have on hand? And after that, you kind of lost it, because you likely don't know who it's been further sent on to. And sometimes that's really key in terms of, do we need to do a recall? Because if it's all long gone and it's not a particularly high risk, there are times when the regulatory agencies will say, well, there's no point because it's gone. But if you don't know, then, so it's kind of, it's back to my earlier point, it's supply chain opacity. It's like you don't know what's behind you and you don't know what's in front of you, depending on where you are sitting in the supply chain. Obviously, Bill's at the tip of the spear, and in that sense, he knows exactly what he's got on his shelves, and from there, it's directly, it's going on to a consumer. But as you work your way back, lack of visibility and lack of knowing what's where, which obviously Recall InfoLink does a lot to fix, is one of the biggest challenges.
Well, you're right about that, David. And one thing, we've come into situations where there's a recall, and I'll get a message from, perfect example, from Bazzuto's, from our category managers or perishable directors, and they'll say, well, Bazzuto's, here's the information. We haven't had this product in a couple months. Okay, and then you question yourself, does a recall go out? Does it not go out? Because that should have turned well before him. However, as a company policy for us, we still send it out just in case customers return the product because they hear it on the news and stuff. when we go through that process. It protects everybody, protects us, protects the customer, and last thing you need is having someone return something and you haven't, the stores aren't aware of it, and they're like, should I take it back? Let me call corporate. And I just think it simplifies and makes things a lot easier and takes away the guesswork.
That's a great best practice, Bill. The other gap that I see actually is on the other end, and it's kind of related. Jim mentioned closing the loop and getting responses back from the stores. There's often a big gap in how much product was actually affected and how much product was actually recovered. The recovered product drives two things. One, it drives credits. So the supplier will issue credit for recovered product that was effectively removed from sale. And it drives the insurance claim. And if a manufacturer can say, well, I recalled 3,000 pounds, but I have no idea how much got recovered, there's going to be a gap in the insurance claim to know how much product actually had to be credited. Well, if you sold 3,000 pounds and you recovered 0, then you had no loss in terms of product sales. But if you sold 3,000 pounds and you recovered 2,500 pounds, well, then you had 2,500 pounds of lost sales that you had to recoup. And so collecting the amount of product that gets removed as a result of a recall often is a gap that affects the economic settling of recalls that we see happening quite often.
We're about at the end of our time. I'm sorry.
I was going to just let me build on this last one. It's not necessarily a gap, but where I think this whole idea of recall ready community fills a gap in a process. Unfortunately, today, recalls are a little bit of, I've dealt with my problem, I've thrown it over the fence, and now it's your problem. So as a manufacturer, I have a recall. I go to a Bazzuto's and say, hey, I've alerted you. It's not your problem. And then you throw it over the fence. I think these end-to-end systems like Recall InfoLink builds in accountability to understand how that recall is executed end-to-end. And it eliminates that over the fence, it's not my problem anymore kind of thing. It really closes that accurate, fast communication loop.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. In addition, we see, and we see this almost on a daily basis. I mean, last week, our system processed over 81,000 outbound recall notices to our clients' customers, both B2C and B2B. One of the things that we see is that the speed of a recall accelerates, so the amount of time that a recall takes decreases. And the faster a recall happens, the lower your brand is, the less brand damage you have, the less liability you have, the lower your costs are. And so using a system to process recalls across the supply chain has this added value of compressing the time that it takes or accelerating the process to help satisfy all the pain points that we've talked about: cost, brand reputation, time, accuracy, etc. So really good discussion here. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger, and thanks everybody today. We are at the end of our time. So I'd just like to thank everybody who was on today. Thank you for everybody who dialed in to listen today. Thank you to Roger, Bill, David, and Jim for sharing all your fantastic insights today. Just want to remind everybody that you can access a recording of this webinar along with all of our other past webinars at NGA's Live Learning Center. So thanks so much again. For NGA, I'm Jim Dudlasek. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.